Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. If there's ever a person with the ruling class bio, it's Vivek Ramaswamy. He went to Harvard, went to Yale Law School, he made a pile in biotech, and you'd think from there he would be like everybody else. But something happened within Vivek Ramaswamy that made him question the system that produced him. And he decided, well, there's a huge problem with the system, actually. It's gone completely off the rails. And he started talking about it. He got attacked for saying it. And then he decided to write a book about it. And not just a quickie book. He doesn't need the money. A book that he thought through. And that it's actually really smart and interesting. It's called Woke Inc. Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam. He minces no words. We're happy to have him on the set with us today. Vivek, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
It's just your trajectory is so different from the trajectory of like probably every one of your classmates.
It is.
That I'm just interested in how you got to where you are, and then we can talk about this book, which is very much worth talking about. But tell us where you're from.
Yeah, so I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My dad came in the late 70s. My mom came in the early 80s, both from India.
Yep.
I asked my dad, why on earth would you come halfway across the world to Cincinnati, Ohio?
Good question.
It's a good question. It's a fair question.
No, I love Cincinnati. But
Cincinnati's great. Yeah, we talked about that. But he said his sister lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which then begged the question to me about why his sister would come halfway across the world to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And we concluded that it's the only U.S. state that has the word India contained in the name of the state. So that was kind of the story we tell. But
good call.
He worked at GE in their Evendale, Ohio plant for 40 years. He's retired now. And that was something that really shaped kind of my upbringing, where he grew up under Jack Welch's tenure at GE, faced layoffs for job security. He actually went to night school and law school. So for me, that's actually when my first introduction to law came up when I was in sixth grade. I would go to night school.
He worked at a GE plant, but then he went to law school.
Yeah, because there was a lot of layoffs in the plant amongst engineers, and so he decided that he would actually get more job security if he also had a legal degree.
Resilient guy.
And ended up working for GE as a lawyer after that to get ahead of the layoffs that Jack Welch implemented there. And so he would take me to night school with him, and I would go. I was in sixth grade, or probably the only sixth grader who in my class had heard of Enton and Scalia, because I'd sit in the back of the class with my dad and listen to all the law that he was learning, and we'd debate it on the way back. And so that's kind of what my upbringing, from sixth grade to eighth grade looked like. And he was really liberal. That's probably when I became a conservative, because we'd argue on the car rides back home. And, years later, I think that stuck with me. Even though I became a scientist, I came back and went to law school myself. And
so you wind up at Harvard, but you don't study sociology. What do you study at Harvard?
I studied biology. I actually took a genetics class in my freshman year, and I thought it was mind-blowing. The human genome had just been sequenced. The idea that we might know something about your destiny or who you are from your genetics, at the time, that was really interesting.
Sure
back
was.
in 2003. So I studied molecular biology. I was kind of the nerdy guy in the lab. Spent most of my time neck deep in the lab in college. And, that was part of why later I kind of had this itch that I had never really fully scratched in law and political philosophy and all that stuff. So I was going to leave my job. So I graduated from Harvard in 2007, ended up working in a biotech investing job. And then I said, okay, I did that for 3 years, but I want to go to law school. So I told my bosses that I was calling it quits and was going to do something different.
Why did you want to go to law school?
Well,
because biotech was kind of exploding, right?
Biotech was exploding, and it was a lot of fun. And I was investing in biotech, and it was a lot of fun. You learn about the science. You learn about the combination of how business meets science. All that was cool. But, a few years in, I kind of had this itch to study kind of the relationship between law and public policy, which I thought was pretty important going forward for just as an American citizen, thinking about problems that I hadn't thought about before. And so I said, I told my bosses that, hey, listen, I'm going to go to law school. I think I want to learn about something different. And they actually said, hey, why don't you keep your job and go to law school, and you can manage a portfolio for us out from New Haven or wherever it is you want to do it. And I said, that was great. So that actually got me some autonomy and ended up getting me some career advancement.
Did you work for your job while you were at law school?
So I did both of those things. So during the day, I would be in law school. I was actually pretty engaged as a student. I didn't phone it in. You didn't have to do that. But I was there not to become a lawyer, but because I thought it was kind of interesting to figure out what I thought about some of these basic legal questions. Figuring out what you actually believe is one of the hardest things, for me at least, one of the hardest things that I've done. But during the night, I would continue my biotech investment research and had fun doing both of those things. That's where I met my wife. She was my next door neighbor.
Well, how did you have time to meet your wife?
Yeah, well, she lived next door.
If you're going to Yale Law School during the day and doing biotech investing at night, doesn't leave a lot of time for romance.
It's actually kind of funny. So the thing I learned is, in being an investor, those actually were 3 of my most successful years, actually, compared to the first 3 years that I worked there. Because I wasn't in New York City. I wasn't sitting on a trading floor listening to the last phone call that came in or the last news item that hit a screen. And part of what makes you a good investor is actually being able to think outside the pack, being able to make a bet that other people aren't willing to make. One of those bets that I made was actually for a drug that ended up becoming a cure for chronic hepatitis C virus at a time where nobody else thought that particular drug had a chance. And so there's something about getting space from New York City that was good for me. And it wasn't like a time-intensive thing, just like some space to think. And then for law school, that was fun because all the other kids wanted to, go to law firm, elite law firm job, then get judicial clerkships and stay on the law firm treadmill. And that's fine. But actually, there was something about the fact that I knew I wasn't going to do that actually made it more fun for me because I could just, you try on an idea like a set of clothes. You try it on, see if it fits. If not, you put it back on the shelf. And to me, that actually made law school really fun where, I didn't go in saying that here's what I think about this issue or here's what I think about that issue. I went there to figure out what I thought about the law and what I thought about public policy. And a lot of what I talk about in the book came out of probably reflection that started during my years in law school.
And we'll get to the book in a sec, but this is the opposite of what most, I would say, the overwhelming majority, in fact, of Yale Law School students conclude when they graduate.
Totally, yeah. There's one thing.
So how did you reach the opposite conclusion from everyone else?
I actually got a better education because of it. Because if you have an idea and everyone around you wants to question it, it forces you to do one of two things. Either they convince you and you change your mind, or you keep your conviction with actually understanding why it is you believed what you did. And I would say 90% of the time, that's what happened. And 10% of the time, okay, I got convinced by a better argument on the other side. I changed my mind. But I'm kind of naturally, kind of like I was telling you with my dad, I'm kind of naturally contrarian. And so when I was surrounded by a bunch of peers and even academics and teachers who forced me to want to think in a different way, it actually kind of cultivated a contrarian impulse in me. And I'd like to think that I would have come to the ideas independently anyway, but that's probably not true. Probably a lot of it was because you're surrounded by megaphones. It actually forces you to
have the same experience,
to run against the grain.
It's a good thing.
I hope so.
It's a good thing. No, that's totally right. So then you graduate Yale Law School. What do you do next?
So that was in 2013. So I had this full-time job as an investor, so I went back and I joined the investment firm. But
where?
It was back in New York City.
Yep.
But, at that point, I had been doing that at the same time I was in law school, met my wife, we were doing all these other things. Now I come full-time back to New York City to be an investor. It was kind of boring, to be really honest. I felt like my learning curve was a little bit flat. I was kind of doing this, going through the motions. And I was investing in this industry that I thought was just so broken. People were starting to talk about the deep state. When I looked at big pharma, I saw the equivalent of what I call deep corporate, which is just a massive government-like bureaucracy where every pharma company has a title in their bureaucracy that's like a mirror image of a title of their counterpart at the FDA. And so you have this entire segment of this entire giant, important industry, by the way, making medicines
very important
for people who need them. This, hard to argue with the importance of that, run by this massive bureaucracy that was so darn inefficient. And by the way, if you're a scientist somewhere at the bottom of that bureaucracy and you make a contribution to discovering a drug that cures hepatitis C or cures high cholesterol or whatever it is, you don't really participate in the profits of that. You get a nice pat on the back, and then the executives at the top of the chain ultimately get to eat the lunch. And so I thought, okay, that could be a really cool opportunity to create a new kind of pharma company where the people who actually make the scientific breakthroughs, who would have thought, actually participate in the upside that they create. And so I was like, all right, so I'm leaving my job as an investor. Let's start a new pharma company.
Wait, a system that rewards creative, smart people with initiative?
That was exactly
rather than career bureaucrats and dullards who follow the rules.
That was basically the thought.
I like it.
That was the thesis. Yeah, exactly. And so I struck out on my own. I left. I told my bosses I'm out of my job in investing. And, in retrospect, you could have said it was a silly decision because it was a pretty comfortable job, went pretty well, worked pretty good hours, made good money. But for me, it was just boring and unfulfilling after having done it for 7 years at that point in time. So I left. I started the company. As easy as that thesis was, I should tell you, it was easier said than done to actually build a company that realized that purpose.
So you go and start your own company.
I go and start my own company.
What does it do, the company?
So we develop drugs. So we look at drugs that other pharma companies, through their bureaucratic wisdom, had let languish, sometimes on their own shelves, sometimes drugs that I thought made sense to develop, but they said were outside of their strategy. And so one of the first drugs that I developed, and there's a reason I chose this area, was Alzheimer's disease. It was actually an area that was really personal to me.
Yeah.
My mom was a geriatric psychiatrist, so she spent her entire career in Ohio treating patients with Alzheimer's disease. And I would often go to the nursing homes with her because, my dad had taken care of my brother, all that. So I would actually play the piano in the nursing home because she was a big believer in at least the role of music in helping patients with Alzheimer's. Not to treat them, but to help them maybe feel better. And a lot of people, have thought about this idea. So I grew up playing the piano in the nursing homes where she was treating patients with Alzheimer's. My grandma's sister died of Alzheimer's disease. And it is one area that back in 2006, 2007, and then certainly 2014 when I started the company, pharma just said, this is too hard. We're throwing in the towel. And even if we've invested a bunch of money, we're going to go in a different direction. And so I said, you know what? That's the contrarian impulse that I had as an investor, that I had in law school. I said, you know what? I'm going to go for Alzheimer's disease. And so I picked up a drug from a big pharma company that they had developed. The scientists there thought it had promise. It wasn't a sure bet. It wasn't a sure bet by any stretch. But we said, we're going to develop it. It's a risk. And we're going to go for it. And that ended up becoming a pretty high-profile drug. And we took it all the way through the phase 3 study. That's like the last stage of the process.
So the pharma company that had originally developed the drug didn't want to pay.
They threw in the towel midway through the process, like in the 5th inning, call it, or the 6th inning. They just said that, okay, we've had too many failures in that area. Let's go focus on some other disease areas. And the scientific head of neuroscience there said, hey, I actually think this is a pretty promising project. Somebody, for the interest of patients, should at least see whether this drug could actually address probably one of the more important diseases in America, right? Alzheimer's disease.
That's for sure. So what does it cost to take a drug from where you bought it all the way?
Yeah, like we're talking like 9-figure sum, right? North of $100 million all in.
Damn.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's
real money. Yeah, so I had to raise money from investors, all of that stuff. But the interesting thing, Tucker, is that was actually probably the first major drug that I developed, right? There was a handful of drugs we started out with. That was by far the highest profile one. And it failed. And it failed massively.
Ouch.
And I remember the moment in 2017 when we turned over the cards. It was a failure, and I'm supposed to go give a speech to my employees at the company to tell them it's going to be all okay. And I'm practicing it in front of the mirror in my apartment that morning. And I just remember I broke down in tears, and I hung out on the bathroom floor for a good half hour before I went into the office. It was kind of, you said I came from a certain pedigree, Harvard College, Yale Law School.
Yeah.
In a certain sense, I'd never really failed on a scale that big.
Right.
And I can say this now.
It sounds like you hadn't failed at all.
Well, I failed on a big scale with that. And that was like my first real failure. And I'm glad, I wouldn't have told you this a year or two even later, but today, when I look back on it, it's actually something that made me who I am and ultimately taught me who I wanted to be going through failure. Yes. And, my parents used to tell me something when I was growing up that stuck with me, but it really only came alive when I went through that experience. And it's that hardship isn't the same thing as victimhood, right? Hardship is just something you encounter. Victimhood is a choice that you make. And I feel like that was a moment where I had a choice to make. Was I going to endure that hardship and be strengthened by it? Or was I going to decide that I was a victim? And that was something that really, that was a real struggle for me in 2017 when that happened. But on the other side of it, thankfully, it actually strengthened the company. I think it strengthened me. We got medicines approved all the way through. We developed medicines that are now approved for other diseases ranging from prostate cancer to overactive bladder. And the company continues developing a lot of medicines to this day.
And became a big success.
Yeah.
I mean, in health, of course, improving people's lives, but also very profitable company.
Well, look, I think that, I hope the company is still on a path to still being in its early days to achieving bigger success later. But I led the company as CEO for 7 years. And in this January, I finally came to the realization that, okay, one of the drugs that I'm probably most proud of that the company developed that's now in the hands of patients is a new drug for prostate cancer. And that's great. But I actually turned my attention to focusing on what I saw as a different kind of cancer. Not a biological cancer, but a cultural cancer that even while there were a lot of people who were addressing biological cancer, I didn't see somebody who was well equipped and willing to address this cultural cancer that even the best of science wasn't going to cure. And so I decided that was the thing that I needed to focus my attention on. I started talking about the infection of what we call the woke agenda.
Well, but wait a second.
And that's where I turned my attention. Yeah.
So you set out to create this biotech company. You do.
Yep.
You fail early, but then you succeed big. Yep. And then you decide 7 years in, actually, I want to do something completely different that's totally outside the very specialized area that I've mastered.
Totally.
What does your wife say?
Yeah, she's been cool about it the whole time. Well, all the way from law school to going to back to my job, my stable job, saying I wanted to quit and start this company with this crazy idea, all the way to what I'm doing now. She's all about realize what helps make you good at what you do, and that's what she does in her life too. And so
but what a change.
That what makes us a match. Yeah, I mean, it was a big change, but it kind of happened gradually, right? So what happened was in February of last year, so this is right before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Actually, my son was about to be born, so it was a big period of change in my life. Yes. Anyway, he was born in February 2020, and I started to notice a big change over the last year in the elite business world. There was suddenly this change that I woke up to amongst the investors that were funding companies like mine, among peer entrepreneurs, where everyone was making a declaration that our company would no longer just pursue profits through the sale of products, but also needed to represent the interests of all stakeholders. That doesn't sound bad on its face.
No.
But it was a curiosity to me that what was it at the same time where all of these companies decide that they're suddenly going to go from 40 years of making products for the pursuit of profit to say, no. Now we companies also care about this other group called stakeholders. Obvious who stakeholders are, right? No, I'm just kidding. I have no idea who they mean by stakeholders. But
I would assume investors, but that's not really what they meant.
No, they mean shareholders. This is stakeholders as distinct from shareholders. So they say we used to maximize profit by selling products for shareholders, but now we're not just about shareholders, we're about stakeholders. So at first I was just curious, who's a stakeholder?
Right.
Is it
everything
workers?
hangs on the terms?
Is it minorities? Is it people of color? Is it the Communist Party of China? Turns out, I think that the last one is actually a pretty darn important stakeholder that not a lot of people talk about when they talk about stakeholders. But anyway, I got curious about this. So I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. I've been focused on building a company. I hadn't written like this, but it was something that bothered me about this whole debate, where you had some old school economists, like a former economics professor of mine at Harvard, that would say, no, the real problem with this stakeholder model is it's going to make companies less efficient at delivering profits for their shareholders. And Milton Friedman said in 1980 that the firm must maximize profit for shareholders because that's how we achieve efficient capital allocation in our economy. To which the other side, a lot of people even like Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, even some people on the right, Marco Rubio has taken up this new model of conscious capitalism, say, no, that model's outdated, and actually corporations have an implicit debt to society that they need to pay off because society allowed corporations to exist, so just serving your shareholders doesn't work. So that was the terms of the debate. And I said, okay, I find the stakeholder thing, there's something about it that annoyed the heck out of me. And
your BS alarm went off.
Yeah, my BS alarm went off. I was a failed stand-up comedian, I should tell you, in New York City, like mediocre to bad. But one of the things I learned that
you've had a lot of different career trajectories.
I'm kind of a little bit distracted easily. So anyway, but one of the things I learned in my stand-up career is that in every good joke, you have something that annoys you. So what I would do is I would start writing down when something annoyed me, write it down. Then you go home and think about it. Then there's something funny there, and you set up lines and punchlines, and okay. For me, there was something about this that really annoyed me, but it wasn't a joke. I think it was something really serious about what was going on with these stakeholders. And the thing that annoyed me wasn't the thing that the economists were worried about, that it was going to make businesses less efficient. Maybe that was true, but that wasn't the thing that annoyed me. The thing that really annoyed me is it effectively said, and it took me a few months to get to this, what it's really saying is that, hey, people like me, CEOs, investors, people who control the dollars in our economy, get to not only control the marketplace of products, but also get to control the marketplace of ideas, right? So the moral questions about whether or not to prioritize carbon emissions versus the price paid for consumer products, or whether one conception of diversity of ideas is more or less important than the visible diversity that we have on a corporate board, those are questions that we all ought to have a stake in, because they're questions about defining how our society works.
That's right.
And I thought we lived in a democracy where everyone's voice, my neighbor in Ohio to your neighbor in wherever you live to wherever we all live, everyone's voice ought to count equally. And that was defied by this idea that actually, no, a small group of CEOs and investors should decide what their views are on those questions for the rest of society at large. And to me, this was a version of old world Europe, where a bunch of church leaders and business leaders used to get in a room and decide what's good for the rest of society. And so it occurred to me that actually the real problem wasn't what these economists and Milton Friedman said, that politics was going to infect private enterprise. It was actually the opposite. Private enterprise and the people who controlled private enterprises were actually going to infect our democracy.
It's so interesting that it's, as it always is, an inversion of their claim. So they're basically saying we owe a debt to society, to our stakeholders. But in effect, what they're saying is we need more power.
Yeah, exactly. We need more power. We need the power to decide not just which products get voted to the top, but which ideas get voted to the top. And guess what? We have economic power in the marketplace that's now going to infect every other sphere of our lives, including what happens in our democracy, including what happens in our society and in our culture.
Right.
And to me, actually, the more I thought about it, I talk about this a little bit in the book, I actually think that it's broadly the left that favors the stakeholder model, though some people on the right do too. But one thing that they actually get right is I actually do think corporations owe an implicit debt to society.
I agree with that.
Because society set up these laws that are really favorable to corporate investors. Complex ideas like limited liability, which says that if you invest in a company and you're an owner of the company, even if something really bad happens in the company and somebody gets sued or slips and falls or whatever, they can collect from the company, but they can't collect from the owners directly. This is a legal creation. So society, they have a point. Society really did endow these corporate shareholders and investors with a lot of benefits. But actually, the debt that we owe is actually not to exercise power outside of the sphere of products, that you focus on the pursuit of profit, not to protect shareholders, but to protect the rest of society from corporate overreach. I mean, my parents came from India, right? I told you about that earlier. Think about the Dutch East India Company in Old World Europe. I mean, that was a company that had its own private militia. It had its own schools, its own hospitals. In America,
it was a country.
It was a country. It was like a nation state within Europe. And America said that actually we don't want corporate nation states. No, we have this thing called democracy where everyone's voice counts equally. Pretty basic idea, but pretty fundamental to the birth of this country. And that's why we set up corporate law to say that actually you corporations get all of these benefits. But in return for those benefits, you better darn well stay in your lane because we don't want you exercising this Frankensteinian power outside of the cage that we have put you in. We don't want the Dutch East India Company here in the United States. And when I look at Facebook or Twitter today, this is the Dutch East India Company on steroids because even they only had a militia or their own currency, which, by the way, Facebook wants to have too. That's a side note. But they couldn't control the thoughts that people were permitted to have. People were still permitted to have conversations in their private life. But Facebook and Twitter, these are the Dutch East India companies of our day, not only want to have their own currency, not only want to have their own market power of who gets to advertise to us, but they actually get to determine what ideas we do and don't discuss. And that actually makes them the most powerful companies in the course of history, not because they're able to make a bunch of profit. I'm okay with that. But because they're able to exercise power over what we can and can't discuss. And to me, that was the biggest threat to democracy of all. And so I put that piece out in February of 2020. An agent approached me and said that, hey, you got to write a book on the back of this. And I hadn't thought about writing a book. So I said, oh, that's kind of a cool idea. Maybe I'll give that a shot. And then, as you're writing a book, you kind of have other ideas. So I started publishing more articles. And the thing I started noticing was that actually there were consequences to me writing for my seat as a CEO.
That's the question on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah.
So basically, you make the case against your world that you occupy.
Yeah.
Your fellow CEOs.
Yeah, exactly.
All the people you went to school with. All the people you see. Right.
Totally.
So how do they respond to this?
So, at first, my first piece was kind of academic and abstract. People, didn't really agree with it. But okay, all right, that's fine. He published one piece. Then I started writing about this stuff more. I started speaking out more, believing that actually I think that CEOs might be making the world a worse place by going out of their way to try to make the world a better place by imposing their own worldview on everybody else. So the more I started escalating this, the more bothered people started to get. It came to a head, Tucker, though, this January. So after January 6th, and I said this to anyone who would listen, what I saw happen on TV that day was, to me, a disgrace. I think it's a shameful stain on the history of our country. But the thing that bothered me even more than what I saw on TV that day is what followed, which was the scourge of political censorship effectuated by the most powerful companies in the world, silencing what Americans could and couldn't hear about what was happening. So that bothered me too much to abide. And I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal arguing that actually Google, Facebook, and Twitter, when they're coordinating with the government and the ascendant party in power to decide who can and can't speak, they're not actually acting as private companies. They're acting as an agent of the state, and the Constitution actually applies to them, and they ought to abide by the First Amendment. So, I can go through, it's a relatively technical legal argument, but I put that out there.
But it makes sense. I mean, as a non-lawyer, I understand it. If politicians government officials use the private sector to eliminate people's freedom of speech, they are violating the First Amendment.
Exactly. The First Amendment applies to the government, not to companies. That's true. But it applies to the government in all senses of applying to the government.
Right.
So, I mean, if I make it really simple, if it's state action in disguise, then the Constitution still applies.
Yes.
It's pretty darn simple.
Yes.
So I put that argument out, and I will tell you, and it's maybe something about the state of the cultural environment after January 6th.
Can I
don't know what it was.
I mean, what you just expressed is a widely understood legal concept. This is not something you made up.
No, this is strong Supreme Court precedent on
this. Is like day one of law school.
This is pretty vanilla stuff. And I co-wrote it with a former law professor of mine, so we put this out in the public sphere, okay?
Okay.
Now, what I didn't anticipate was the reaction that would follow. And I think the country was just in such a charged place. I mean, in some ways we still are, but was such a charged place those few weeks that I got messages from, and these are people who I respect and love, but a friend told me, my friends have made money investing in your company. Don't ruin it for them. I had a former employee who called me. She was in tears, and she said, Vivek, I had such high hopes for you. What happened to you? And these things really
out there defending the First Amendment. How dare you?
Yeah, but in this environment, because that means you're on one side of a two-sided debate. Whereas to me, it's not about Trump or not Trump. It's about the basic principles that define who we are as an American democracy. I had advisors to my company that resigned, and so that caused me to take
seriously.
Yeah. So that caused me to take a big step back and say, you know what? Ironically, if I'm being honest with myself, I might have brought my own argument full circle from a year before, where I made the case that corporate CEOs need to stay out of politics and not use their corporation as a platform to foist their views onto other people.
Yes.
Now, to be clear, I never did that. I was speaking strictly as a citizen. The company was run separately, and I didn't mix the two. But when I was talking about issues that were apparently this contentious, to me, I then decided that to protect the company, I needed to do what I needed to do as a citizen, because I didn't feel right stopping or censoring what I was going to say, because I felt the moment was too important. And so I had to make a choice. And so I made the choice, and I decided to step down as CEO this January. I became chairman. I'm still chairman of the company. I put the number 2 person at the company, who I'd run it with for the last several years, in charge as CEO. Side note, he happens to be liberal, very different political perspectives than mine. He's also brilliant, and he's well equipped to run the company. And on the day that I made that announcement, I told our employees that I'm separating my personal voice from the voice of the company in order to protect the company. And let's just say nobody was confused about what I meant. And there was a certain irony that stuck with me about that.
And kind of a sad thing, really. You should be able to defend the First Amendment in the pages of the Wall Street Journal without giving up control of your company. Yeah. Like what?
Yeah, and nobody made, and I want to be super clear, nobody made me do it here. This was a voluntary decision that I made, but it's because of, so it had nothing to do with our company and everything to do with the cultural moment that we live in that, when left-leaning CEOs like Mark Benioff or whatever write about their politics, it doesn't hurt them. I think it actually seems to help them.
Right.
But my situation was different, and certainly that irony stuck with me. But the good news is, Tucker, I think that a good barometer for the health of our democracy, of American democracy, is a really simple one. It's the percentage of people who are willing to say what they actually believe in public. It's that simple. And I think right now,
it's a great measure.
We are doing so badly on that metric that as I reflect on it, I wasn't free to do that as a CEO. But now I am.
Can you say that again out loud, slowly, just so people can write it down? Because I think it's a really wise
It's just a really simple metric. When I think about the health of a democracy, really any democracy, but especially American democracy, it's really simple. It is the percentage of people who are willing to say what they actually believe in public. And right now, we are doing abysmally on that metric. And when I reflect on it, first personally, as a human being, I wasn't free to say what I actually believed as CEO. That's why I had to separate my voice from my company. But now I am as a citizen. And I'm not going to mince words about what I think we need to do about the cultural epidemic that we're facing as a people. That's what the book's all about.
You are defending traditional American liberalism in the best sense.
Classical liberalism,
You're
absolutely.
arguing for a diversity of viewpoints. You're explaining how that diversity, and you lived it, improved you as a person, made you wiser, better informed, sharpened your own ideas because you rubbed up against people who disagreed with you. And you're calling for people to have the freedom of conscience that our Constitution guarantees.
Exactly.
You're arguing the least radical, most American thing you could argue.
I think so. And when I was growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 90s and early 2000s, if I said that, okay, I'm going to stand for a political position that says that we live in a country where we believe in free speech and the open exchange of ideas and this thing called the American dream, which is that no matter who your parents were or where you came from, you can achieve anything you ever want in this country with your own hard work and dedication and commitment, something like that. You probably would have rightly laughed at me and said that that's not a political position. We all agree on that.
It's not a political position.
We're
No,
Americans,
that's
right? That's part of what it means to be American.
Well, that is America. Like, what else is
That's
America?
What else
Right.
is America if not that, right? America is an idea. It's not the geographic space that we occupy. It's a set of
That's
ideas
the
that brings us
American
together.
creed right there.
That is the American creed. And so to me, we now live in a moment where there's a political movement that doesn't... The political movements in the 90s, by the way, used to disagree a lot too, but they would take those ideals as given and say, okay, what policies best realize those ideals? And that's what we would debate. But now I think the lines of political debate have really changed in our country, where it's about whether you believe in those ideals, the existence of them, the validity of them, or not. And to me, I guess I don't think about this as a political book, but if you think those are the political lines, then call it a political book. But I think of it as a book that revives classical American ideas like individualism, like the idea that you can achieve whatever you want, irrespective of the color of your skin, that you ought to be judged, not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character.
Amen.
The idea that we all come together, e pluribus unum, from many one, and that we respect what one another have to say and are right to say it, even if we disagree vehemently with one another. Those are the basic ideas that you would have taken for granted 30 years ago.
We've got a whole show about this every night at 8. And every day, literally every single day of the week, there comes a point where I think, I cannot believe we're having to defend these ideas.
Yeah.
In the country I was born in, I'm sure you feel the same way. Like, I never thought we'd have to defend this. They're worth defending. Tell us what wokeness is.
Yeah, so there's the complicated definition and there's the simple definition.
Yes.
The complicated definition borrows from Marxist thought, which says that the social universe is governed by these invisible power structures that determine how you and I relate to one another. And Marxist thought said that those power structures were defined by economic relationships, by economic power, by how much money we did or didn't have, by how much capital we controlled. Agree or not, I happen to not identify as Marxist. There's something coherent about that logic, right?
There is.
Because anybody can be disempowered if they ultimately don't control capital in an economy that relies on the flow of capital. Okay. That was the Marxist worldview.
Yes, and there's some truth in that.
Yeah, I think we can debate it. I think we can discuss it.
But it's a much more fluid understanding because you can go from being a capital holder to being someone who is economically powerless.
Exactly.
And you can go in the other direction.
And you could be in any country or you could be any skin color, but you could be disempowered because you don't have money. And money buys you the ability to buy the things that you want.
It's a universalist message in the sense.
It kind of is universalist.
It applies to everybody, and it's based on immutable principles that have to do with your behavior rather than your genetics.
100% right. Nailed it. Now, wokeism borrows from the theory of these invisible power structures, but it says, Marxist, you didn't quite get that right. So when people say wokeness is Marxism, I think they're off by half.
I agree.
Wokeism says something different. No, the real axes of disempowerment are genetically inherited. It is your race and your gender and your sexual orientation, and that the real problem wasn't economic injustice or poverty. No, it was racism and misogyny and bigotry. And the thing that I learned about over the course of reflecting on this from my book is that actually presented the opportunity of a generation for Wall Street right around the 2008 financial crisis. So you'll remember, I told you I was working in an investment firm in New York that I joined in 2007. I lived the 2008 financial crisis. The firm that I worked for shrunk massively on the back of the 2008 financial crisis. I lived in New York City during the Occupy Wall Street movements. I understood that shaped my view of capitalism, to be really honest with you. I love capitalism, but I also grew wary of capitalism when it got commingled with politics, which is what we saw in the post-2008 era. And the interesting thing about wokeism is it was born right around that same time. And if you're a Wall Street bank, Occupy Wall Street, that's a pretty tough pill to swallow. It has its origins in Marxism, right? That's pretty tough. But this new woke stuff is actually pretty easy. You applaud diversity and inclusion, put some token minorities on your boards, muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change or whatever it is, and you're good to go. And so Goldman Sachs, as they did last year, can issue from the mountaintops of Davos an edict that says they will not take a company public in the United States if its board is insufficiently diverse, where Goldman, of course, defines what counts as diverse. They don't mean ideological diversity. I'll tell you that. But they were happy to dance to this new woke tune, to lend their money, their legitimacy to this new woke movement. but they didn't do it for free. They effectively had an ask to the new left. This is the mutually deal with the devil in both directions, where the new left, the new Democratic Party, has to look the other way when it comes to leaving their corporate power intact. And so what you have is a bunch of people in my generation, a bunch of woke millennials, get together with a bunch of big banks. Together they birth woke capitalism, and then they put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. And that's really when wokeness met capitalism. That's when it went from a fringe theory in the academy to becoming supercharged with the potency of capitalism. And when it mixed with capitalism, that's when wokeness became unstoppable.
Talk about an axis of evil.
Totally.
I mean, this might be the ugliest, most dangerous alliance in American history. I can't think of anything more destructive than what you just described.
Yeah, and the funny thing is it's an arranged marriage, but not of love. It is more like mutual prostitution because each side in this marriage secretly has contempt for the other. They have secret contempt for the other. And any marriage in which each side secretly disdains the other isn't going to end well. But right now it's working because each side is getting something out of it.
Can we skip to the part where they eat each other and we enjoy it as we watch?
Well, there's a part that comes in between then, which is where this bilateral arranged marriage actually turns into what I call a threesome, which is the Communist Party of China getting in on the act, right? So they see what's going on here with this arranged marriage, and they say, okay, this is actually an opportunity. And the opportunity is this. If we can get those companies to criticize the United States in the United States, but stay silent about our actual human rights abuses here in China, we can do the thing that we could have never done with our nuclear arsenal. And that is to undermine the moral standing of the United States on the global stage. So they got in on this act. There's a Chinese word for wokeness, as you well know, baizuo, which literally refers to woke white people, and they used to laugh at us. But it's not just a joke. They are now using that as a geopolitical tool to say, oh, Nike and Disney and the NBA and Marriott, you want to criticize the United States? Have at it. If you criticize China, we're going to build a great Chinese wall and you can't enter our market. But if you criticize the United States, we're going to roll out the red carpet to you. And by the way, if you're Airbnb, we're going to roll out the red carpet if and only if you give us the consumer data that you gathered from your progressive consumers who love it when you post a black square on Instagram, a condition for Airbnb's entry to China. That's a little known secret that the Wall Street Journal reported on last year. But that's how this game is played.
Oh, you're upsetting me.
Your blood will boil. Yeah. It makes my blood boil.
I know all this. I don't think I've ever heard it as clearly explained as you just did.
I spent a year and a half thinking about it for the book, so I better be able to tell you a little something about it. But it is maddening to watch the way in which they're playing us like a Chinese mandolin, and it is working. And the way they've done is they have turned these corporations into Trojan horses that undermine the United States from within, because they are now the new international arbiters of moral justice. And so China can go to the UN, and if they're pressed about the Uyghur human rights crisis by the EU, as they were last year, the first thing that comes out of Xi Jinping's mouth is, actually, Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. But now you don't have to take it from Xi Jinping. You could take it from Nike. You could take it from the NBA. You could take it from Disney, the neutral arbiters of moral justice, who actually make a better buck because they can enter the Chinese market if they shut up about China, but they criticize the United States. But for China, they get something out of that trade, back to that mutual prostitution. It's now three-way prostitution, where China's able to get something out of it, which is the people who are known to criticize injustice never criticize injustice over here. That creates this false equivalence between Chinese nihilism and American idealism. And when that happens, Chinese nihilism wins every time. Thank you, LeBron James. Thank you, Disney. Thank you, NBA. That's the world that we live in. And so that is what I call the birth of this woke industrial complex. It is a new Leviathan, a new monster that is far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes might have envisioned 400 years ago. And it is the biggest threat to individual liberty today. It is not big government alone. Conservatives are reciting lines that they memorized in 1980, thinking that big government was the threat to individual liberty. Maybe it was in 1980. It's not today. It is this new hybrid of big government and big business, and big government not just in the United States, but big government in places like China, commingled with big business, creating the actual threat to our liberty and our prosperity. And it's really hard to know what to do about it when we have spent the last 40 years defending the castle of capitalism from the front door without recognizing that that castle was invaded through the back door from woke activists to the Chinese Communist Party. And I think the defining challenge for us as Americans today is, how do we actually sterilize that castle without burning the whole thing down. And I think that looking the other way and pretending like the problem doesn't exist, like a lot of Republicans like to do, isn't the answer. But just saying we want to tear the whole thing down, where a lot of people on the right and on the left might want to take that approach too, isn't going to leave us with the thing that made us great. It's going to have to be something else altogether.
Well, I do feel that impulse myself, and I feel like I've been a lifelong defender of market capitalism. In some ways, I regret that now. But watching this, it's so frustrating. Your democracy is stolen out from underneath you by some of the worst people in the world who then turn and lecture you about your moral deficiencies. It's supernaturally frustrating.
Totally.
And so you can see at a certain point, if this continues, people are going to say, you know what, I'm just done with it. Let's
start
burn Nike.
Let's burn it down.
Right. Let's burn it down. And I get that.
And I understand. If I have to pick which instinct I'm more sympathetic to, I'm more sympathetic to that instinct than to turn the other way and recite some slogan from 1980 and pretend the problem doesn't exist. But I think if we really care about preserving what this country's all about, the decision's a different direction.
Well, I totally agree, because actually you don't, in the end, want to be left impoverished.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want that. Yeah. And I don't think a lot of Americans who have never seen real poverty understand what that means.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we just don't have real poverty here and haven't for generations. So people are kind of quick to, whatever, it's fine. It's actually not fine. Go to a poor country. It's not fine at all. So what do we do?
Yeah, so I think the right place to focus first is on the relationship between these companies and government itself, right? So that basic principle that the government cannot use companies to do indirectly what the government can't do directly is something that echoes and reverberates today in ways that are really hard to see because we're designed to be hidden from seeing it. I talk a little bit about the book about one of the practices from the Obama administration, for example. I talked about the 2008 financial crisis, right? Well, on the back of the 2008 crisis, guess what? There were multi-billion-dollar settlements with each of the banks. They were supposed to pay it to the fisc of the U.S. Treasury. Well, guess what? Not a lot of those dollars reached the U.S. Treasury, which is, by the way, what is the fisc, the public fisc that Americans each have a stake in. No. What happened was that the Obama administration had tried to get a lot of left-wing nonprofits funded through Congress. The Republican-controlled Congress said no. Call it obstructionist. That's life in a two-party system. But they had a creative idea. They went in the other direction, and they said, actually, organizations like the National Urban League or La Raza, they used the DOJ to say that we're actually going to settle with you, big banks, and we're going to say that if you give $1 to one of those organizations, we'll give you a $2 offset for how much you owe on this settlement to the U.S. government. And guess what? It makes for a much better press release to say you give $1 to La Raza or the National Urban League than it does to give $1 in a settlement fine to the DOJ. Oh, those are 501c3s, a fancy way of saying that's tax deductible? Oh, that's a nice benefit too. And by the way, you end up paying less money in the end. So the Obama administration wins, big government wins, the banks win, they pay less money, and being fond of money, that's actually a very good thing if you're a bank, but also get a great reputational benefit out of it, giving out to nonprofits.
And the permanent left-wing nonprofit infrastructure becomes rich.
Becomes permanent, becomes ossified, becomes legitimized because the elites in the country are deciding that those are the places where they want to give money. But the real losers are quite literally, when I talk about the social justice scam, the real losers are quite literally the American people because the public fisc ends up with less money in it. So even though they announce these multi-billion-dollar settlements, that money doesn't actually end up with the American public where it was supposed to belong if the DOJ is bringing that case.
Where the hell are Republicans?
Nobody's talking about this stuff. Nobody's talking about this stuff. So that's why I think sunlight is the first disinfectant. It's not the end all be all, but it's the first step. So that's why I kind of expose a lot of those practices in the book in this new woke industrial marriage, this woke industrial complex.
So people don't even know that that's happening.
People have no clue that that's happening. People have no clue that's happening. You make a progressive declaration, blow woke smoke, and that's the smoke screen that makes the whole thing work like a magic trick, right? If you're a magician, you walk beautiful women on stage, you blow smoke, flashing lights, distract people from the real trick. This game, Tucker, is a magic trick. It is a magic trick for corporate America. Big government gets its back scratched. The people left holding the bag are the American people as we know it. That is the game that we're playing. We're seeing it with big tech censorship, pretending like these are private companies when, in fact, it's the puppet masters in the Biden administration that we hear now daily are pulling the strings about misinformation and hate speech.
They're just saying it out loud now.
So that's just this game. But the thing that's frustrating is that I think actually liberals should arguably be most frustrated of all. They're corporate power skeptics, right? They rightly or wrongly, I think in this case rightly, are against, in principle, the concentration of power in the hands of corporations, but they're blinded by their love of these new woke causes, and so they look the other way. And meanwhile, conservatives, who could be holding this industrial complex to account, are duped by their own ideology that says that the free market can do no wrong, without recognizing that the free market that we idealize does not exist today. And so both sides are actually duped into submission, and therein rises this new monster, this new 21st century demon, the woke industrial complex, that we haven't yet seen it for what it actually is. So if this book's anything, I don't have all the answers and all the solutions. I offer some, but at the very least, it is a description of the problem that could be the first step towards.
I just feel like we're getting to a dangerous place because everything you've just said is true. Everyone understands it on an instinctive level.
Instinctive, yeah.
Don't know the details. They know they're getting scammed. They know this is a giant scam, and they're losing in it. And that generates levels of frustration that are dangerous. The country's getting volatile, and you can feel it.
It does.
Right?
It really does.
I'm worried that the normal pressure relief valve of democracy, where it's like, if you don't like it, you can vote, your vote matters, people don't believe that anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm very concerned about where this goes. So you've got to be one of the most articulate critics of this system that you participated in, that you know very well, that you were effectively, by your education, raised to participate in at the highest levels. And once again, I have to say, you know a lot of the people involved in this.
I wasn't born into it, but I was educated into it.
Right, no,
yeah,
but I mean,
exactly.
Our system at its best is a meritocracy. So it takes smart people and it puts them on a track toward leadership, which is exactly the track that you went on. Good for you. I just can't get over what a betrayal this is of your social world.
Totally.
It's a total betrayal.
It really is.
And so you basically were raised to be this guy, and you whipped around and you're like, oh, this system is totally corrupt, and you're all participating in it. How do people respond to you?
You know, it's really funny because a lot of people, I mean, it's not everybody, but a good minority actually tell me behind closed doors, thank you for speaking up because you are saying what we cannot say, because we'll ultimately otherwise bear economic punishment. So at least
but they acknowledge that you're right.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I get a message on Signal from a Wall Street analyst the other day who says, thank you for speaking out in the way that you are because the rest of us can't. A prominent guy in the healthcare world. And so that's actually this new culture of fear that defines our moment. And to me, the choice that we're asking people to make, everyday Americans right now to make, is a choice between the American dream and the First Amendment. The idea that either you get to speak your mind or you get to reliably put food on the dinner table, but you no longer can do both at the same time. And to me, we talked about America being defined on the basis of ideas. Well, if America's defined on one idea, Tucker, it's the idea that you get to do both of those things at the same time. You get to speak your mind and you get to put food on the dinner table reliably. You have the American dream and the First Amendment. We don't force you to choose. You get to have both. And I felt that, look, I didn't grow up in a rich household, but as somebody who has now lived the full arc of the American dream, I don't have to worry about putting food on the dinner table. I don't have to worry about getting fired because I started my own company and I'm still the founder and chairman of that company. You know what? If somebody who's lived the benefit of the American dream can't give it up in order to fight for these, then I don't think anybody else will.
Well, I completely agree with you, and I feel that way too. And I'm not rich, but I paid my house off, and at that point I was like, I don't give a shit. I'm just going to say what I think, and I mean it. What I'm so struck by is people who are way richer than me, that's for sure, who are still afraid to tell the truth, and I just think it's very weird.
It's weird. It's bizarre.
You make $100 million. We used to call that FU money, or $1 billion, and yet none of them, they all seem captive to these rules that are insane. Like, why aren't there more brave rich people? I mean,
Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, the guy's worth God knows how much, ungodly amount of money, yet he seems afraid of criticism of what somebody's going to say about him on a given day. And to me, what is the point of having $60 billion if you can't actually stand for the values that were supposed to have made Facebook, which is a free and open internet, the belief in free speech and open debate, the kind of stuff that he used to say when soon after he was a Harvard student, he was a year ahead of me.
Yeah.
Guess what? Even if you're the richest guy in the world and you have to supplicate to this ideology, then that's actually a scary place where we are in this culture of fear.
So, but what does that come from? Is it a brain worm? Is it like a mass mental illness? Is it conventional social pressure? Like, why? Why aren't rich people brave?
Yeah, I think it's just a broader symptom of the broader cultural malaise in America, where, I'm part of a generation where I'm a little younger than you. I'm a millennial. People younger than me are Gen Z. We're part of a generation that is, as people always have been, hungry for a cause, hungry for a sense of purpose, hungry for meaning, hungry for identity. Right? These are things that human beings crave, that Americans crave. And the things that used to fill that void, right? Things like faith, like belief in God, like patriotism or belief in country, or hard work for that matter, have disappeared, right? Patriotism's on the decline. Religion has nearly disappeared. And the problem is that leaves a vacuum in its wake, a black hole, a moral void. And when that vacuum runs so deep, that is when darker forces begin to fill the void. Modern secular religions like wokeism or scientism, which is distinct from science. It is a religion unto itself.
Certainly is.
And those new religions satisfy the religious impulses that we all have, but when we don't direct it towards conventional religion, or belief systems that we have, but we don't direct it as patriotism to belief in our country, we're still human beings. We need those beliefs to direct somewhere. And when that vacuum is so deep, we now live in a moment where corporations and other elites are able to make an extra buck and aggregate power by peddling us this wokest nonsense. But that has become the modern opioid for the masses. And I think that, even if you just think about a basic question, I think about the most basic question I can ask as an American right now. What does it mean to be an American in the year 2021? I don't think we have a good answer to that question.
No, we don't.
And I think our absence of an answer to that question is the black hole at the center of our nation's soul. And when you have a black hole that runs that deep, that's when you actually get poison that fills the void.
I totally agree.
And that's what we got to do, Tucker, is I've spent the last, I write the book, and much of the book rails on the diversity, equity, inclusion agenda, and people can read it and form their own opinions. But after actually writing the book, I've kind of come to the conclusion that the right answer isn't just fighting back against this stuff. If you actually care about driving change, the real answer is to fill that moral void with something more meaningful that doesn't just stamp out wokeism.
That's right.
But it dilutes it to irrelevance. And if I was in the left, by the way, that'd be my strategy to fighting racism in return. I think when you go to the final leg of racism in the United States and you try to stamp it out with a hammer, you just inflame the whole thing and make it a lot worse. The thing you're supposed to do, if I was giving advice to my friends on the left, is dilute it to irrelevance by making it so unimportant that we don't have to pay attention to it anymore.
Exactly right.
But I think on the other side,
you're actually moving toward that. It seemed to me in my lifetime.
We were around 2010, and then when wokeness met capitalism, the whole thing actually became this supercharged affair that completely derailed, where we were finally in that last leg and almost in the promised land. We dropped the ball. But I think that on the right, people need to practice what they preach in reverse too, is not just stamping out and fighting critical race theory in the schools. And believe me, there's no bigger critic of it, at least in my community, than I've been. But I think that actually we got to go further than that and fill that moral void with civic value, with civic education. That's actually going to be our way out of this.
What kind of country do you want? So you've got one of my favorite books. You pulled it off our bookshelf.
Yeah.
The Brothers Karamazov, The Brothers K by Dostoevsky, one of the great geniuses of the 19th century. Why did you pull that book off the shelf?
Well, I was hanging out before the show, and I saw it on your shelf, and I thought it was a remarkable book because it's actually one of my favorite reads, too. There's a story in here that I love. It was a story I learned about Christ. And I'm not Christian. I went to Catholic high school, and I first heard this story during my Catholic education. It was a story about Christ, not from the Bible, but from the Grand Inquisitor chapter of this book. And it's a poem where Christ comes back to earth in the middle of the Spanish Inquisition. And he's spotted on the street. Everyone recognizes him for who he is. The Grand Inquisitor, who's in charge of the Spanish Inquisition in Seville, has him arrested, puts him in a prison cell, and sentences him to death. And the beautiful part of that story is the exchange, the dialogue between Christ and the Grand Inquisitor. And what the Grand Inquisitor tells Christ is that the church does not need you anymore. Your work has already been done. Now we need to move on without you. And he sentences Christ to execution the next morning. And to me, that is exactly what's happening in the modern church of diversity, where in the name of diversity, we have actually sacrificed true diversity of thought. And that new church of diversity with a capital D has sentenced the old vision, the true God of true diversity of thought, to execution. And so the way the story ends is I think, provides a difficult but the right path forward. Is actually the way Christ ends it is he doesn't say a word. He listens to the Grand Inquisitor until he finishes his story. And then he pauses. And then he leaves him with a kiss. And the Grand Inquisitor is so puzzled by it that Christ just walks right out the door, and the Grand Inquisitor is left speechless as Christ walks into the distance. So that's the way the story ends. And I think, holding yourself to the standard of Christ, whether in the Bible or in the Brothers K, is a hard standard to hold yourself by, no matter who you are. But I think it offers the beginning of the clue. It's kind of what I was saying earlier, which is it's not just about, he didn't strangle the Grand Inquisitor to death.